but during, oh, there we go. The state advocacy committee meets weekly during legislative session, and so that's been really helpful for running the Shoreline Action Network, which I'll talk about later, because I get some insider knowledge from the paid lobbyists that Washington State PTA works with about where efforts should and shouldn't be directed, and kind of what legislators are saying, maybe behind closed doors sometimes. And my role is really to advocate for Shoreline schools, teachers, students, and my focus has been on the budget issues that we've been facing and primarily state funding. And then tonight I just want to say, interrupt. If I miss a question or a hand up or something in the chat, let me know. But I want this to really address your needs and interests, so I don't mind being interrupted if something's unclear or if there's something I didn't explain well or just needs more detail. And then I just want to add that I started this role when my son was a kindergartner, and I started kind of halfway through the year, January 23. Oh, sorry, my mom is texting me. Great. So I started in January 23, and my background's in healthcare, not anything legal or legislation wise. So just to say, I've learned a lot. I'm still learning, but if I can do it, anyone can do it. So I'm happy to share what I've learned. All right, so we're going to go into the next slide when you're ready. You can go to slide 2. So kind of starting with the basics, what is advocacy? It can sound intimidating. I know it's a hard role to fill in our PTAs. It's not the fun party planning, but really advocacy is why PTA was founded. We're the oldest child advocacy group. We have 84,000 members, so we are a powerful group. We hope to grow those numbers. But advocacy is anything you do for the welfare of students, families, your school community, or district. And it can simply be just seeing or hearing about something that you think should be addressed and doing something about it. Even if doing something is just to inform your members, talk to your principal, talk to your district leaders, or bring it to the attention of your legislators. And this should be a part of every member's role. So even if you aren't the advocacy chair, you still are an advocate. And if your PTA doesn't have an advocacy chair, every member should be partaking in advocacy. And it, again, isn't always synonymous with legislation, but that's going to be a lot of what we talk about tonight because of how outdated our state funding models have become. And it's why we are in kind of the hard budget reductions that we're facing right now. It's important to know what can and can't be done as a PTA because we are a nonprofit. We can advocate for legislation, we can advocate for levies and bonds, but school districts cannot advocate for specific pieces of legislation. They can tell us kind of general things that are happening and what might hurt us, what might help us, but they can't really give direction. And so within that, as a PTA, you can't specifically talk about legislation through Parent Square and Peach Jar because those are district sponsored. But you can send things out through your PTA newsletters and through Facebook, and you can certainly talk about them and should be talking about them with other parents and at meetings. The one thing PTAs can't do is endorse candidates. And there's a resource linked there that kind of goes into more detail. The best thing to do is to, at the very least, if you want to take a position, have a vote by your board, but the best practice is to have membership vote. And so just last week, the Shoreline PTA general membership meeting, one representative met from every PTA last Monday, and we voted on a legislative letter, which will kind of be my blueprint for going forward in session. Okay, yep, you can go to the next one. So if you remember nothing else tonight, advocacy doesn't have to be complicated. The data a lot of times comes from the school district, is going to come from myself and other PTA members. What we really need our community to do is get personal, get comfortable reaching out to legislators via email, asking to have meetings via Zoom, and just sharing how these budget reductions are affecting your family. And when I meet with legislators and I share the facts and figures and I ask, like, how can we be more powerful? How can we be heard? This is what they tell me every time. We need people to reach out to us individually. We need their personal stories because we take these anecdotes and we use them when we're negotiating in Olympia. A lot of times they kind of pair off behind closed doors and they're not negotiating, saying they want this bill through, or other people want this bill through, or we want this much money versus this much money. And they use these anecdotes saying, hey, this is from my constituent. This is what they're struggling with. This is why we need, the cap removed, or this is why we need the multiplier raised because my constituent in Shoreline said that their child is struggling for these reasons. If you want the facts and figures, a great resource is the district and Shoreline PTA Council websites. So I try to update that as often as I can. There's an advocacy tab there. So you can reference kind of what funding shortfalls we're facing, but don't feel like you have to do that. The most important thing is your stories. And the best time to do that is now. January 13th is when session is going to start, and they get very busy. You can meet with them during session, but you get about half the time. Instead of 30 minutes, you get about 15. So if you want more of their attention, and now is a good time to reach out to them because they're still kind of thinking about what bills they might be sponsoring, this is the time to do it. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Let's see. All right, and then slide 4. So talking about effective advocacy action networks. So there's 3 of them I'm going to talk about. Locally, there's the Shoreline Action Network, so that's the one I run. And it was put together by my former co-chair, Jill Jackson. And we came up with the idea because we saw what Washington State PTA was doing, but we just felt like they weren't using it a lot. They use it during Focus Week leading up to Focus Day, which I'll talk a little bit later. But we really wanted something to kind of come out weekly during legislative session and follow bills as they go through the legislative process. So the Shoreline Action Network is focused on legislation. We try not to reach out to people outside of that timeline. We did a little bit this year with the election and the different initiatives that were on the ballot. But primarily it's going to be a weekly action alert that comes out during legislative session, so January to April. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those will look like later. I want to touch on the state PTA action alert. So that again comes out less frequently, but if you subscribe with that link, you're also going to get access to, you'll get invited to events with the lobbyists. So there's 2 coming up where she's what to expect for legislative session, registration for Focus Day. You're going to get all her bills that she's tracking and what status they are. So kind of a lot of not all of the information I get from the committee, but a lot of it. So if you really want to be in the know, subscribing to the state PTA action alert is more than just the form letters. You get a lot more newsletters and things that are going on at the state level. And then there's the federal level, and you would want to subscribe to the national PTA action alerts. So going back to the Shoreline Action Network, things you can expect to receive are opportunities for pre-drafted letters where we're going to put all that data in there for you about a specific piece of legislation, and then we would ask you just to edit it 1 to 2 sentences. My name is Mallory, I have a 2nd grader at Highland Terrace, and budget cuts have really affected me or my student or my child this year in this way. It doesn't have to be very long because the we'll have the meat of the letter already done for you. Sometimes we do petition letters where you're just signing on your name. And then early on in legislative session, we might not be at the point where we've narrowed our focus down to a few key bills. So we'll be kind of giving you maybe a half dozen bills to pay attention to and show you how to navigate kind of step by step the website. That's the ledge.wa.gov website. And there's opportunities for you to just hit pro, con, or other. And usually we're going to be saying, please click pro for this bill because we want it to be moved forward. We want it to get assigned to a committee. And so really we're just trying to make this super easy for, we know this is a steep learning curve for a lot of people. We know people are busy, they're getting inundated with lots of emails from their school already. So we're just trying to make it, 30 seconds or a minute here or there to point, click, done, because just the more united our effort can be and just repetitive senators and representatives hearing the same message from many different people is the way to be most effective. If there's kind of pause there, if there's any questions, let me know. Also on this slide, I put in my notes that if you want more details, the Washington State PTA website, which is wastatepta.org. There's an advocacy tab and there's a toolkit that's really helpful. There's a link there that highlights school districts versus legislative districts, because it needs to be a statewide effort. It would be great if 10,000 people from Shoreline were really sending emails, but we really need it to be a statewide effort. So there's been some people that have asked me, like, we need to get people in Eastern Washington saying these things. We need to talk about people south of Seattle and north of Everett. But legislators don't want to meet with people, or it's more powerful when they hear kind of people, their own constituents joining together. So if you want to figure out which school districts are in the legislative districts you want to target, there's a great link on that site that you can use. And then they also have kind of how-tos about how to meet with legislators, how to testify on bills, more details about the legislative process and how to read a bill. And then there's also a tab for committees. So some people are more interested in the federal legislation. And so there's a committee you can join for the federal advocacy committee that I am not on. There's many ways to be involved and learn more. So let's go on to slide 5. Let's see. Great. So legislative session. So it moves very fast. We need to be able to reach people directly, and it can't be associated with the district. So that's the reason for the Shoreline Action Network and these other districts. So yes, you do need to subscribe if you want this information. We tried briefly in the first year that Jill and I were putting this together, going through like room parents, but by the time the room parent actually emailed all the parents, the window to take action had passed. So the takeaway is that things move really quickly and bills tend to die. So let's see. I'm reading my notes here and then getting lost. Okay, so what the Shoreline Action Network will do as I learn more with the state action, the state advocacy committee, is we'll identify key pieces of legislation to focus on. So last year, for example, we focused on an MSOC bill, which was utilities and insurance funding, and we focused on a paraeducator bill, and we did some isolation and restraint. And that's kind of really listening to Marie about what has the most traction. And most bills die. Legislation is kind of designed to kill bills, not pass them. So it's really important that bills are followed through every stage. Each bill will either have an H or an S in front of it. So that just designates whether it's going to be in the House or the Senate. And then they have to not only pass the originating chamber, and then they have to cross and pass the other chamber. So what that means is, say there's a transportation bill. If it starts in the House, it's got to first get assigned to a committee. And so that's where we would say, like, oh, click on this button that says vote pro. We really want to increase transportation funding for Shoreline for these reasons. And that would show that there's a lot of interest and support for this bill. And then hopefully it would be assigned to a committee that could be in the House Education Committee. And then there's a deadline for it to get out of that committee. If it doesn't get voted on, have a hearing by a certain date, then that bill would be kind of dead in the water. So you would get an action alert that would target all the House Education Committee members, saying this is really important for Shoreline and statewide for these reasons. These are the funding gaps. It would, give you encouragement to add your own personal anecdote. And then hopefully that bill would move from the policy committee stage to the financial committee stage. And there would be a deadline for that. It's usually within a week later. That part moves pretty quick. And so there would be very similar text, but targeting a different group of legislators because they would all be on the financial committee. And then that process would repeat again for the rules committee, again, similar text, different group of people. And then we would ask that that bill be sent to the floor if it was still viable, voted on, passed at the floor, and then that process repeats almost verbatim, but in the Senate and vice versa. So sometimes people get kind of action network fatigue, or they think, oh no, I already did that. I already, advocated for transportation. But if you've gotten a new email, it's because it's got a new target. So hopefully I explained that somewhat clearly. If there's questions, let me know. But the meetings for the education and financial committees tend to happen, or at least last year, they tended to happen Monday to Wednesday. And my meetings with Washington State PTA were on Thursday nights. So I would try to send an action alert out Friday to Sunday with the hope that people would act early on in the beginning of that next week. Okay, we can go to the next slide. It should say, why advocate? So another question I get a lot is, does this really make a difference? Is there any point? And the answer is yes. They work for you. You voted them. They are responsible to you. They want to hear from you. And the more they hear the same message from a larger group of people, the more impact it makes. There's a ton of competing interests. So even though it seems so straightforward and obvious to most of us that education should be a primary focus, they are hearing a lot. When I go to their town halls, they're hearing a lot about safety. They're hearing a lot about fentanyl and drug and crime issues, cost of living and housing and taxes. And so there are a lot of competing interests. And so the more public pressure, again, with a united message, that moves the dial. So last year, the Action Network, it was our first kind of full year of using it. We sent over 20,000 letters to state legislators, and we more than doubled our unreserved ending fund balance for last year. So they just came out with final numbers in November, and we hit $7.1 million, and I think we were supposed to be more like under 2. So we did that, and that was largely due to some increased enrollment, but also because we received mid-year state funding from legislation because MSOC numbers, MSOC funding increased and the paraeducator model increased, and they started that kind of retroactively. So we got more funding last year than what we were expecting. And so great, pat on the back, but obviously it did not solve our budget issues. We still have a lot of outdated models. The paraeducator is still under what Shoreline does, but it was a step in the right direction. And so our expenditures still outpace our revenue. And we are still looking at a lower ending fund balance this year. And if nothing is done for 25, 26, we're expected to be in the red, which would put us in binding conditions. So that's why we're still looking at budget reductions. But because of that enrollment, we are no longer looking at a school closure. And so then I'm going to go into more detail about legislation next, if I don't see any questions. Okay. So let's go to slide 7 there, the things to know legislative session. Okay, so there's 2 types of sessions. There's a short one and a long one. Short sessions are even years. We're about to go into a long session. Really important to get familiar with the ledge.wa.gov website. They just kind of updated it, so I had to get re-familiar with it, but I think we'll go into some detail. We should have some time to do that. But I've included some links that I've kind of stumbled across the last couple of years that I think are really helpful. So if you're interested in how the legislative process works, the stuff I'm going to talk about can be applied to any piece of legislation, not just education. If there's something that you want to focus on that maybe the Action Network isn't, this would be how you would do it. So the cutoff calendar link is important because that will kind of give you a timeline of when you need to make sure you're advocating for your bill so that it doesn't die. And then this email roster link is a great one because you can go to the committee that your bill is in and it'll list all the committee members, but it won't link their emails and it won't list their emails. So you have to kind of go back and forth and compile your list in 2 different places. So that email roster is really handy because that lists every senator, every representative, and their aides and their email. And then I've listed the kind of committees that I'm tracking. Most of the bills or all of the bills that the Action Network will be advocating for will go through these committees. So there's the policy committee for the House and Senate, which is education or early learning in K-12. And then the financial committees for the House, it's appropriations. For Senate, it's called Ways and Means. And then they all have to go through the rules, whether that's House or Senate, before they go to the floor. So those are the targets. Those links have the lists of the people that are on those committees. So the beauty of these action networks, whether it's the Shoreline one, the state one, or the national one, all this is done on the back end for you. But again, if you're interested in how it works or want to do things on your own, that would be how you would do it. And then it should also be noted that these committees aren't quite final. It should be finalized sometime in mid to late December because we just had an election year and I think they're still moving some people around a little bit. So you may see some changes if you click on the links now versus later in the month. Let's see, what's the next slide? Let's go to 8 there. Okay, there's the cutoff calendar. And so you can see it's still in draft mode. So they're very much still kind of finalizing things for January. But it just gives an example. That's kind of hard to see, but it starts January 13th. And if you look at February 21st, you can see that's a cutoff for the policy committee. And then within the week, February 28th, bills have to move out of the financial committee. So it's kind of a slow start where things are being introduced and assigned to committees, but then by mid-February, things kind of get rolling quickly. And a lot of things start to we'll probably have a long list, and then that list will start to get a lot shorter of things that we're following as we get into late February, March. All right, and we can go to the next one. All right, so this is where we might pull up the ledge.wa website. But this is kind of what's going to happen during session. So yeah, if you want to pull that up, Jen, you can. So if you have a bill that you want to get kind of personal updates on, or maybe should I just share my screen? Would that be easier? Let's see. There should be, oh, here we go. Yep. So here's the website. Oh, did it go away? Oh, there we go. Okay. And you would go to find bill or initiative. And so if you're doing this on your own, you would want to know what bills you're interested in, or again, subscribing to the state PTA Action Network, you're going to get Marie Sullivan's list of bills that she's following. So you could type in ones that you're interested in there. So let's see. If you could type in that 5882 bill, and it's not going to, and pull down the tab on the left for last year, because it won't show up for this year yet. So this was the paraeducator bill that passed. And I just kind of wanted to give people an example of what it would look like. So if this was live, if this bill hadn't passed and signed into law yet, you have the SB for Senate, you have what the bill is, and then you have your sponsor. So this is District 1 for Lake Forest Park. Senator Sanford wrote this bill, and then these are all co-sponsors. So it's important to kind of acknowledge or thank him if you're writing to him about the bill. It also had a companion bill, so it had support from both the House and the Senate. So they were kind of tag team running through at the same time. And so there would be a button if this were live and this bill hadn't passed yet, where it would say like, you want to get email notifications or alerts. And so then it would send you a personal email when this bill gets assigned to a committee, when it's going to have a hearing. So you could do that for as many bills as you'd like. Step 2 would be, there would be an option here, and this is what the Action Network would take you through, to support, oppose, or be neutral about this bill, and then an option to type out additional comments. And that would be written into the public record there. And then if you go back to, let's see, yeah, actually, let's scroll down a little bit. This, so this bill is passed, so it talks a little bit about the history. If you're interested in any of the minutia here, it just kind of talks about when it made it through different committees. If you go down to roll call, that will tell you who voted for it, who voted against it. And then you can see it made it all the way through and got signed into law. At the bottom, scroll up a little bit. Yeah, right there, March 19th, governor signed. So we know that that one passed. So that's a bill that successfully made it through legislative session. If you want to go back to the slide, there's a link I want to pull up. For the committee and the how to testify once the bill is in the committee stage. So we've talked about the email notifications, sending a comment. Now let's say a bill's been assigned to a committee, and there's a link here. So go ahead and click on that and see if that'll open up. So you should know if it's HB, it's going to be in the House. So you would click on that. And so just, you can go ahead and click on any of those options. Click, I guess, just House to start. And then, so then there would be another drop down tab because session hasn't started, but it would be, you're in the House. Now, what committee do you want? Most likely be education. And then there's going to be options to testify remotely via Zoom, testify in person if you want to drive down to Olympia, or just submit written testimony. And that's a very powerful thing to do. The state committee, one of our roles is to get wide representation within PTA and have lots of different people testify on behalf of PTA. So if that's something you're interested in, reach out to me and I can help you do that. A lot of times, last year we wrote the testimony for you and gave you like a 60-second, 90-second, or 120-second option, because they'll tell you like day of how much time they're going to give you. And really the hardest part is just waiting online for your turn on Zoom. Sometimes it's a couple hours, but once you're on, you really just have to read and speak clearly. But if you want to do it on your own, of course, you're welcome to, as a private citizen or just a parent, or students would be great. They love hearing from students. But you sign up when that bill is assigned a hearing, and the sooner the better, because sometimes they do run out of time or they can't hear from everyone. So we can go back to the PowerPoint. The other thing you can do is write or call the legislators that are in the committee where your bill is sitting and ask them to schedule a hearing if there hasn't been a hearing. If there's already been a hearing, you would ask them to schedule an executive session, which is where they kind of decide on whether the bill is going to move forward or not. Or you could simply say, like, move this bill forward to the next stage or move it forward to the floor. And I think I already talked about how quickly and how busy they are if you wanted to meet with them via Zoom or in person, that it's 15 minutes and they're talking for at least half that time too. So you want to make sure you have your talking points written out pretty succinctly. Let's see. Let me go to the chat here and see if there's any questions. Okay. Yeah, if there's anything I need to repeat, let me know. Or I think Jen said she's compiling a list of links. So if anything gets gone over too quickly, I think she's going to get that out, because I want to make sure people have all the information they need. All right, so let's go to slide 10, and we're going to talk about the big three. So state PTA has legislative session every year, and that's where we vote on the legislative priorities for the upcoming biennium, so 25 to 26. And so that happened in October, and the takeaway there is listed out what the 5 are: close the funding gaps, the student mental health crisis, special education funding and policy, preventing and reducing gun violence and suicide, and expanding school construction funding options. But within the close the funding gaps, the things that are highlighted are the big three, which are special education funding, MSOC, which are the utilities, and insurance, and basically anything that goes into running a school that's not staff. So curriculum is another example, and student transportation. And those are highlighted because they would benefit every district in our state. If those buckets were full, a lot of our states would not be looking at binding, or a lot of our districts would not be looking at binding conditions. They would be in a lot healthier financial situation. And so it's not that we only want those buckets filled, but that's our priority. That's where we want them to start. And then long term, it's addressing the outdated funding models. So let's see. Oh, and I guess I just want to say another pro for the big three is it's not just Washington State PTA that's behind this. For the first time, I think ever, for education advocacy, we've got WASDA saying the same thing as us, which is school directors, school board directors, WASA, school administrators, AWSP, which are principals. We've got the ESD, the educational service districts. Teachers unions are partially on board. They're asking for maybe a few different things than us, but they definitely are highlighting special ed, MSOC, and transportation, but I think they've got a couple other additional asks. So legislators have expressed to me and to most people who have been doing this much longer than me that they're tired of hearing, okay, from this group we want this, and from this group we want this. And so there's been a collective effort to put forward this big three. And so I think there's been some questions. There were some questions about that during legislative assembly, and it was really powerful to hear from these other groups that were represented about how legislators already know what the big three are. We're already expecting to see bills addressing all three. So it's encouraging that there's finally collective movement in the education advocacy world. Okay, and then continuing on with that is Focus Day. So there's a yearly event put on by Washington State PTA, and for this coming year, it's going to be on President's Day, February 17th. It's the first day of midwinter break. This is an in-person event in Olympia. There will be opportunities to meet with legislators, so I'll be setting those up. Last year, I was limited to 8 people per meeting, so that filled up quickly because we tried to include students. So 1 parent, 1 student. I don't know if that'll be the same limit this year, but I'll find out those details probably in January. So students are highly encouraged to attend, of all ages. Wear your PTA blue. That's my email there if you're interested or need more information. Registration is going to open on the 19th. And again, you'll hear about this stuff if you're signing up for the Washington State PTA alerts. You'll get that registration link. Anything I missed here in my notes? I think so. Okay, we can go on to, I guess, the last slide here. So kind of what I'm hoping for, piggybacking on what we focused on last year with the Shoreline Action Network, special education bills, removing the cap, increasing the multiplier. I was told by Marie Sullivan, the lobbyist, that isolation and restraint might be revisited. It didn't pass last year, and I think the primary reason was that they wanted funding for training included in the bill, and so I'll be looking for that. And then, like I mentioned already, those big 3, the MSOC and transportation, we're expecting bills to be introduced to address those. Last year, there were some staffing model bills. There was one for librarians, one for principals. They didn't make it very far. I don't know how much traction there will be for staffing model updates, but if any of those bills are introduced, those are things I'll definitely be highlighting with the Action Network. And I think that's everything. Everybody got, let's see, is this where we sign up? Yeah, I can put the link in there, but there should be a button on the PTA website.
And I'll just note, as Mallory said, I'm going to make a list of all I'll post the PowerPoint, the video, and then the just a document with all the different links in it so that you can click on the links and it will take you to the right place. Hopefully this weekend. I can't promise that, but that's my goal. And that will be on our Shoreline Special Education website.
Morgan?
Hi, I'm new to this group. My son's in kindergarten at Ridgecrest, and sorry I was a little bit late. I had a conflict. So I don't know the norms of interacting on these meetings. So, but I had a curiosity. Is there discussion around contingencies if, like depending on the new presidential administration impact to public education, like are there contingency plans that y'all have discussed or that you're aware of, like at the state level of like, hey, we might shift if we need to focus and put effort around other things that might not,
So
that might reprioritize.
Are you asking if like the federal Department of Education is dissolved, what's the plan?
Yeah, essentially.
I think that's a great point to bring up to our legislators who might push back and say, yeah, we have other priorities or there's money we need to put elsewhere. I think that's a great point to bring across. I don't know of any contingency plan that's been discussed, but it's certainly
Thank you.
thought about. And then Vincent has a question, what legislators and other stakeholders are opposed to these kinds of bills, the big three, and why. So I don't know legislators that are necessarily opposed to the big three. It's just a matter of competing priorities. So we're told that funding is going to be tight. Historically, they've made, very incremental and small steps, and it hasn't been anything substantial in recent years to really help districts avoid binding conditions or avoid budget cuts. And that's really what we're trying to express, is there's a sense of urgency, that there's 7 districts in binding conditions and like almost 20 on the cusp, on the brink. And we're really kind of at this precipice where things are coming to a head. And so I don't think legislators quite yet get that sense of urgency. There are groups that are opposed to public education receiving any increase in funding, no matter how straightforward it sounds, because they'll cite, they test scores were not good enough to deserve more funding, that were wasteful, that districts are in this position because of mismanagement. I would argue that how can this many districts be mismanaging their funds? And if they are mismanaging their funds, even more reason for, the state to step in and help. But Shoreline, for example, has been audited many, many times, and there has not been mismanagement. There is simply an outdated funding. There was a great article that came out that said we're basically funding like it's 2006, and think of how much has changed since then, and it's just not realistic. And then there are conservative groups. There's the Washington Policy Center, which publishes articles that don't tell whole truths. Last year, they targeted the paraeducator model, saying that it was removing teachers from classrooms when it wasn't. We were increasing the ratio for paraeducators. We weren't reducing certificated staff at all, but they kept reiterating that because it was a catchy headline. And then there's the conservative ladies of Washington who argued against the MSOC bill last year. And MSOC, again, is for basic things that we are legally mandated to have as a school district, like having insurance and having heat and utilities and power. And we are like $300 less per student than we should be. And this group was saying that because we are changing how we're teaching history, or because we are open to different groups of people, we celebrate Pride week or month, that we shouldn't receive any increase in funding for insurance and utilities. So those messages are hard to hear. They're infuriating for me. Hopefully that's good motivation for you all, that's what's being said, to kind of keep tabs on these bills. And you don't have to have in-depth knowledge. Just expressing your support for public education is enough. Any other questions? Let's see. Strategy to create urgency, make a lot of noise. Yep. Combat misinformation. Yep. Yeah, just disseminate information, repeat messaging. Legislators need to hear the message from as many different people individually as possible. Yeah, Sarah?
If we are interested in, you had talked about if people are interested in testifying, what's the best way to contact you for that, if that's something people are interested in? Through the Action Network or email?
Through email. Yeah, the Action Network, I don't think if you reply to it, I think it just goes to my email. So it's just, the ledge chair at shorelinepta.org. If you have a bill that you're particularly passionate about, and then if that's something that state PTA at the Advocacy Committee decides that they're going to organize testimony around, I can say I have a volunteer. Or if it's something that they're not focused on and you just need some help doing that, I can help you do that.
Any other questions for Mallory? That was really helpful for me. Thank you, Mallory.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Thank you, Mallory. And Sarah, not to take over your role, but I think we're done. But if anybody wants to stick on just to chat for a little while, I'll turn off the recording and we can just hang out and chat for a little bit if anybody wants to. I'll stay on.
I will too.
And if you have students that are interested in doing this, this is a great, great way to get students involved. And it's something I've been trying to get the high school kids linked into, but it's, again, those district PTA boundaries are hard sometimes.